does our infatuation with the human image come from? Does it come from the wonder of our improbable existence in the universe? Is it our drive to find and attract a suitable mate? Is it our need as social beings to judge ourselves against the standards of beauty so we can find our proper place in the tribe? Or is it just the vanity of an unchecked ego? From the earliest times, human beings have manufactured the human likeness. The earliest renderings seem to exist for spiritual or ritualistic purposes, to evoke or placate the powers of nature or the gods. Now, to be sure, there was always a kind of visual connection to the gods for humans. They must look kind of like us, of course. And because we were made in their image, we must be something special. In African and pre-Columbian art, human likeness was abstracted to represent the otherworldliness of the spirits evoked. But still, 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth of the human face is often recognizable. In ancient Egypt, where the rulers became gods themselves, or so they claim, a kind of crossover opportunity developed for the representation of the human form. By the time we arrive at ancient Greece, the abstraction is gone and the gods and goddesses look just like us. Those of us that are incredibly buff, that is. But as civilization stabilized and social classes began to stratify, artists and artisans soon turned their talents toward those that allowed them to make a living, wealthy flesh and blood humans. Soon, the glorification and memorialization of the ruling classes accompanied the rendition of the gods in art. What can we learn about the way people saw themselves from these images? Painting in China has a 5,000-year history. While there are many stylistic approaches by artists over this time, and many books written about painting by Chinese artists, the philosophical aspects of each epoch show in the paintings. Generally, Chinese painters focused on the most important aspect of the painting, leaving the backgrounds empty or minimally developed. The form was primarily defined by line, rather than light and shadow, perhaps because ink was the primary media in Chinese painting. Color was usually symbolic rather than representational. While Chinese painting covers a vast array of subjects, there was a long tradition of making images of the emperor and other government officials. We can easily see changes in both fashion and artistic styles over the ages. For the most part, the figure is the primary concern of the artist, and information about the standing of the sitter comes through in the clothing and the objects or implements shown. In the latter part of the Ming Dynasty, around the 16th or 17th centuries, ancestor portraits became popular among those who could afford them. Because of the belief that their ancestors remain close to the family, and if properly honored will help bring prosperity and good fortune to those still living, ancestor portraits allowed for the memory of the ancestor to be always present in the home. Rarely were they shown to outsiders. These portraits were usually painted posthumously, and achieving the correct likeness was often a challenge for the artist. The face was the focus, and because the emphasis was on the deceased, the artist was never noted. Curiously, because the feet were considered the most erotic part of a woman, her feet were always covered in these paintings. In the West, the Roman Empire had dominated for 1,000 years, from about 5 BCE to 5 AD. The human likeness represented both the gods and secular subjects. Around the 5th century, Rome began to crumble under its own weight. It had grown too big, too corrupt, and too arrogant. It could no longer resist the pressure from northern adversaries, from the expansion of the Islamic Caliphate. The period from 622 to 750 is known as the Islamic Golden Age, as science, philosophy, math, and art flourished in the Arab world. For Europe, however, this time was known as the Dark or Middle Ages. With the collapse of the Roman Empire, it was no longer safe to travel freely. No one took care of the roads and aqueducts. With the depopulation of cities due to civil wars, plague, and invaders, people congregated in nation-states ruled by kings. People paid tax to the king in exchange for protection. This period of turmoil meant that Europeans were more isolated. Fear, and along with it superstition, replaced the rationality of the Greeks and Romans. Into this void stepped the Catholic Church, a conduit between this life, which was often brutal, and the next life, promising heavenly rewards. Much of the European art of this time revolved around teaching the illiterate masses about religious precepts or the glory of its leaders. Due to an emphasis on storytelling, human likenesses were more symbolic, and naturalness was not emphasized. It was mainly the church and the royalty that patronized artists. The interests of these two groups were often politically intertwined, and their interests are often reflected in the art. The term Dark Ages is perhaps misleading. There was innovation happening in science, art, and architecture during this time, although it sometimes met resistance from the church and was set back due to the Black Plague, wars, and famine which wiped out about a third of the population of Europe in the mid-14th century. Along with the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, this was a tough time to be a European. But towards the end of the 14th century, things began to settle down. Strong nation-states arose. Exploration of trade and other cultures, along with a fortuitous period of good weather, allowed Europe to regain its footing and build wealth and stability. With this wealth and stability came the rise of a prosperous merchant class. As Europe emerged from this rough period, a renewed interest in naturalism started to manifest itself in many areas of life, but especially art. This period is known as the Renaissance, which means rebirth. The Renaissance began in Italy, primarily in Florence, but eventually spread throughout Europe. Religious subjects were still paramount, but artists began to focus on a more representational depiction of the human figure. Art patronage expanded beyond the realm of the royals and the church to include this new merchant class. The Florentines were a democratic-leaning bunch, and although the politics of the city were manipulated behind the scenes by the powerful Medici family, rich Florentines as a rule preferred to dress down to show their egalitarian bent. Notice how most of these portraits are in profile, as if the sitter was unaware of being the subject of a painting. However, artists knew which side their bread was buttered on, and we can see how they flattered their patrons. In this painting of Federico di Montefeltro and his wife, the landscape behind the couple indicates that he is lord and master of Urbino. Outside of Italy, in Northern Europe, this Renaissance came more slowly due to lack of political stability. In the north, there was less interest in the Italians' humanism, and more concern with religious reform. A discontent with the distant Catholic Church saw the rise of Protestantism, and with it came a more secular view of life. In painting, two interesting things happened in the north, one technical and one pictorial. The first was the development of oil painting. Up until the 14th century, the primary media for painters was egg tempera. Pigment was mixed with the white of an egg as a binder. This meant that the paint dried rather quickly, and it was problematic to work with in the cooler climates of northern Europe. Oil painting, while not invented in Flanders, was more suited to the artists there. Robert Campin and Jan van Eyck perfected the use of a slower drying oil to glaze their paintings with thin colors, allowing for a subtle blending of light and shadow that gave their figures a more lifelike appearance. The second innovation was the depiction of the sitter in three-quarter view. Here the subjects stare directly at us, unashamed of the confidence they feel at mastering the world. While seemingly a small thing, this connection with the viewer signals a shift in attitude. No longer at the mercy of the church for validation or salvation, this new class of northern merchants take on the world on their own terms. And like the Chinese paintings we saw earlier, artists include worldly objects to symbolize the status of their subjects.
Another crucifix is hidden in the corner of one of the most famous Renaissance portraits, Holbein's painting of Jean de Dinteville and Georges de Selve, known as the Ambassadors. Again, it is a subtle sign that these two successful young men know not to feel too proud of their expensive clothes and of the range of objects which show the viewer just how learned they both are. We are assured that they are always aware of death, which floats in front of them in the form of a distorted skull. When viewed from the side, it becomes instantly recognizable. The sheer vanity involved in commissioning such a magnificent portrait is balanced by this firm reminder that all of these beautiful things will crumble to dust. The only everlasting life is with God. This painting was made in 1533, a time of particular religious tension. Dinteville was a French ambassador sent to the English King Henry VIII's court, just as Henry was preparing to break from the Catholic Church. Several of the objects seem to suggest anxiety about the situation. For example, the lute has a broken string, a sign that harmony has temporarily been disrupted. D'Antville commissioned this portrait when his friend came to visit him, noting that de Selve's presence had greatly cheered him during a rather miserable time in his life.
Meanwhile, back in Italy, artists continued to make stylistic changes. Oil paint had arrived on the Italian scene. In the early Renaissance, there had been an almost obsessive use of mathematical perspective in painting. The Medicis established themselves as patron of the arts, separate from the church or government. At the end of the 15th century, Italy enters into a short period known as the High Renaissance, which is typified by three giants of Western art: Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. Leonardo was a master painter and used the glazing properties of oil paint, known as fumato, to create his luminescent paintings. The Mona Lisa, perhaps the most famous painting of all time, is the culmination of Leonardo's skill. When Leonardo was commissioned to make this painting, he never parted with it and carried it with him whenever he traveled. Michelangelo was primarily a sculptor and made very few paintings on canvas. However, fresco painting seemed to suit him, as the mixture of plaster and paint perhaps bridged the gap between sculpture and painting for him. His Sistine Chapel ceiling is truly one of the greatest accomplishments of mankind. Raphael was the youngest of the three. However, he was quite prolific in his short life. He died at age 37, 1 year before Leonardo. Many of his work can be found in the Vatican, and some scholars feel his skills rivaled those of Leonardo. Through their stylistic and compositional choices, the works of these and other artists from the High Renaissance period highlight the Italian Renaissance's interest in humanism. Religious figures are painted with the same humble naturalism as secular subjects. No more gold leaf or ostentatious halos. Man's relationship to God was now more accessible. The High Renaissance was such an amazing time for art that the artists that came after were faced with the dilemma of what to do next. Would they ever be able to match the virtuosity of those previous artists? In order to distinguish themselves, artists in the 16th century started to play with exaggerated form, harsh colors, and looser brushwork. This style is known as Mannerism. Giuseppe Arcimboldo, a court painter for the Habsburgs in Vienna and later Rudolf II in Prague, appealed to the exotic tastes of the 16th century public, which valued riddles and puzzles. He cleverly constructed his portraits from fruits and vegetables. A bit later, in a period known as the Baroque, some painters using a style known as chiaroscuro had their figures emerge from deep dark grounds into bright light, creating dramatic effect. Artists began to paint their subjects more objectively, showing the darker side of courtly life, warts and all. As the century progressed, more and more ornamentation appeared in the compositions. Artists continued to push their dramatic envelope with swirling and voluptuous figures. In France, this ornamentation was augmented with pastel colors and softer brushwork, in a style that became known as Rococo. Reacting against the dramatic style of the Baroque and Rococo painters, artists in the late 18th century returned to naturalism and a classical style. This was due partly to increased contact with the vast natural landscape of the New World in the Americas. Also, the political upheaval due to the French and American revolutions, inspired by the ideas of the Enlightenment, brought a renewed interest in the ideals of the ancient Greeks and the democratic process. 18th century painting glorified the adventurous spirit of those taking on new political challenges and imperialist conquests. By the 19th century, many European countries were colonial powers. Many countries had made the transition from imperial governments to republican or democratic ones. While these transitions were never smooth, a sense of egalitarianism was at least an ideal to shoot for. Some artists began to use as their subjects the everyday citizen. showing the conditions of those left behind by the new freedoms and opportunities supposedly built into these new political systems. Painters generally fell into one of two camps: the realists, who felt that reality told us all we needed to know about the world, and the romantics, who felt that there were larger, more intangible ideas, like liberty and beauty, which humans could only know through an emotional response. The end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century ushers in the age of modernism. We'll leave that for another video. Portraiture continued, but the ideals of a new age, as well as the development of photography, allowed artists to take a more expressive and original approach to it. Even still, it's clear that the fascination with the human likeness, our own likeness, remains.